and along with Sean. Okay, good. Thank you for doing that. Okay, off we go. I'm Melissa Fenley, along with Sean Anderson. We are chairs of the Program and Events Committee of the Society of Fellows. We are the dedicated alumni group of the American Academy in Rome. This afternoon, we are hosting the first in the online series of Tuesday Talks titled Writing, Research, Books. And we're tuning in on a Sunday because David Mayernik is in Roma. And we have some other friends in Venice, so it's very lovely. We're all here together. Johannes Knoops, Fellow in Architecture in 2000, and David Mayernik, Fellow in Architecture in 1989, will share their personal readings of the city of Venice. But first, just a little bit on our speakers. Johannes Knoops is an architect and tenured professor at the Fashion Institute of Technology, State University of New York, where he teaches interior design. With a Bachelor's of Architecture from Pratt Institute and a Master's from Yale University, Johannes has led a multidisciplinary design practice for over 30 years here in his native New York City. His research has had the support of the SUNY Foundation, American Academy in Rome, National Endowment for the Humanities, National Institute for Architectural Education, the Graham Foundation, and a number of residencies, including time with the Emily Harvey Foundation in Venice. Widely published and exhibited, his personal research focuses on issues of memory and place.
Thank you.
And Sean will introduce David Mayernik.
Yes, and greetings everyone. David Mayernik is an artist, designer, author, and educator with almost 40 years of experience in art and design. His work weaves arts and architecture together as a model for the modern recovery of old master principles. He has won numerous awards, including the Arthur Ross Award from Classical America, along with Thomas N. Reikovich, for their design of the Minnesota State Capitol grounds. With Federico Del Carlo, he founded the Tuscan Renaissance Academy in Lucca to promote and teach the principles of Renaissance art and culture. More intriguingly, perhaps, is that David also studied fresco painting with renowned restorer Leonetto Tintori. He has painted frescoes for his own buildings at the Tassis campus in Lugano and for churches in Ticino and Tuscany, as well as in the city of Lucca in 2013. He is an associate professor with the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, teaches design studios, seminars in history and theory and drawing, and is coming to us live from Roma, from which I'm very envious. Benvenuto David, benvenuto Johannes.
Grazie a tutti.
If I could just mention to everybody to please mute yourselves and turn off your cameras perhaps, because it does make it easier for our speakers to share their screens. Thank you.
Should I start? Okay, let me share my screen. It will take a second, sorry. This is more of a book presentation in a way, but I'd like to thank everyone. And we're very proud to start off this series on books. And you'll find tonight is highly focused on books. David will be speaking on a variety of theater of books and such. And I will be focused on my recent sabbatical project in search of Aldus, Pius, Manutius. Many of you already know Aldus, in Italian, Aldo Nuzio. Some of you may even know more about Aldus than I do, I bet. Aldus was a humanist, a scholar, an educator, but most importantly, he was founder of the Aldine Press. The Aldine Press was located, he started the Aldine Press in Venice. For him, Venice provided the greatest source of Greek texts available at the time outside of Constantinople, in part also because of the collection of the Cardinal Besson,
Does somebody not know how to flush the toilet after they've had a shit? What do you mean? Well, it was fucking one of yous. Disgusting.
Hi. Okay, but he's most popularly known for a variety of things, particularly his interest in replicating the human hand that was so common in manuscripts within typefaces in his printed books. We can thank him for the origins of the typeface Bembo and the like. He's also given credit, rightly or wrongly, for the first paperbacks outside of ecclesiastical needs. He is credited with codifying the use of the semicolon. He is credited also for publishing for the first time a living author in print. And within his household, he spoke Greek and employed 30 Greek speakers at the Aldine Press, a place he often referred to as a therme, a place of discourse, where much time was spent on the translations, getting the translations correct, going back to the manuscripts. And in fact, he spent more money on the translations than he did on the actual production of his books. Erasmus was so impressed with his work that he traveled to Venice, spent time with Aldus, and developed several volumes along with Aldus. So we need to understand this, and this ties into David's. By the end of the 15th century, Venice had 200 printers and issued more works than Rome, Florence, and Milan combined. It was a real center of printing that lasted for quite some time. So he initiated the Aldine Press in 1494, the first publication coming out the following year. Let's see, and the first location is credited to this building on the right. And it's claimed that it was in this building until his marriage to his backer daughter, Maria Tassini. And an abbot Venier placed this plaque in 1828 to commemorate Aldus's achievements. Well, we need to understand a little about this abbot. He was an abbot at Saint Thomas. He placed, this is at the time of Austrian occupation, French occupation, but Venice was under occupation and it switched back and forth. We need to understand that there's this need for pride, Venetian pride, even though the empire, the Serenissima, has come to an end. There's a need to identify themselves as Venetians and their achievements. So this abbot Venier went around and placed 13 plaques across the city of Venice, most of which are correct, most, 3 of which are wrong, including Petrarch and unfortunately Aldus. But that didn't stop for the students of Padua from putting up a second plaque to commemorate this location. And you can see the plaques, one here and other to the upper left. And there's our abbot Venier. Well, within months of the abbot placing his first plaque on this building, people denounced it, other historians, and particularly the author of the Inscrizioni Veneziane, Raccolte ed Illustrate, which is the biblical, the real guide to the source of Venetian street names. And the author, Chioggione, said, unless the abbot has some proof in his pocket, we should not believe this, because there was no evidence. This was hundreds of years after the fact. He put the plaque in 1828. Aldus was 1500. There was no physical evidence. But what we do have are 11 letters with addresses and descriptions on how to find the place. And the descriptions all give us, give mention to the Campo San Agustin. They give mention, many of them, to the bakery. They give mention to the church of San Agustin. But we can find proof here in the famous Veduta, the 1500 view by Jacopo, Barbari. It's an incredible perspective. They say it is accurate from the whole width of Venice within 5 meters. You know, this guy was doing it from bell towers and maybe a balloon, but it's an incredible achievement. So let's zoom in. We're going to look at this portion of the map here. And here's our church. Here's our church of San Agustin. These are the canals in blue. Okay, there's the church. We have very little documentation on the church itself. This is one drawing, and there's a couple other little sketches that could be anything from a shoebox to a mailbox. So in order to understand the building, we look at this view. And so I made a model of the building in order to understand it. Its origins go back to the 10th century. And it was always called the Church of St. Augustine. And so if we think of it as a 10th century church, it was most likely, and other historians have said this, a basilica format. But we only have this view. So here's my model, which pretty much replicates the geometry. And then when we think about a basilica format, it would have had an apse. So knowing the column lines and the dimensions, and we'll go backwards in time on this, that would have been the size of the apse, very similar to the Church of San Paolo, on the Campo San Paolo. But we wouldn't have seen the apse from here. Well, why does the apse matter? Well, because it said, and we'll look at the plans, that Aldus's shop was directly on the Campo. But instead, well, this is, here, let's diverge for a second. This is the Rio della Pergola. This has since been filled in. It's now a Rio Terra. And we need to know about this Rio because the building that is celebrated is this building here. That's where the abbot placed his plaque. Well, if we look at this, that building is not on the Campo. This building is on the Rio. And quite literally, there's that building again on the right, and the Rio would have been this. There's no doubt that if you were going to describe this building, you would say it's on the Rio della Pergola. I mean, there would be no, especially knowing how people described Venice. It was through its canals, through its waterways, that one would locate a building. So kind of curious. That's such a, none of the descriptions ever mentioned. Nor did they mention this palazzo. It's actually a noble building, and it's, oh, let me get the exact name of it, sorry. The Palazzo Soranzo Pisani. Yeah, I mean, it's not one of the biggest noble buildings in Venice, but it's certainly a notable one in that it was directly across the street. So this is the relationship. I did this reconstruction based on mappings. I spent my sabbatical looking at the history of maps at the Cini Foundation and other archives within Venice. Actually, I need to redo this bridge. This bridge would have been flat. It's one of the, at least at the time of the Barbari view, there were actually 7 flat bridges that allowed horses to enter and traverse across a canal. We're not exactly sure how people navigated that. Maybe the bridge was moved, but that was one of the 7. And so another key element to this mystery, it's really a kind of puzzle that I spent my time on, is this bakery. This bakery is mentioned in land documents going back to the 10th century. And it was a bakery until just 2 years ago, sadly. Hundreds of years of bakery, and there's the last owner of the bakery. It's now vacant. They had hopes of leasing it to a Chinese grocery. Luckily, that didn't happen. Hopefully, someone will open up Bar Aldus and make that viable. But so here we go. There's the bakery, and what I'm trying to illustrate is that Aldus's printing press, the Aldine press, was right across. We even have a reference to the cahier or in a couple of letters. And the cahier to store is the little alley, the little cahier between the 2 buildings. All right, so there it is. And so this is Aldus's building here. But what we're seeing is an apartment block, a turn of the century apartment block that is compromising the front door of Aldus's shop to the campo. Well, if we reconstruct the church and go backwards in time, that door had been directly on the campo, and proving the letters. It's now not a very nice restaurant, a mediocre restaurant called Due Colone. But it still retains its Renaissance door details, and there are columns within that speak to its dates. So today, we have this apartment block, and I've recreated it pretty precisely based on the digital map of Venice that was so popular in those books 5 years ago or so, longer. So, so that's the footprint today of the building. And you see that Aldus is no longer on the campo. The bakery is. And there's our erroneous location to the right, which is nowhere near the campo, but had been on the Rio. Okay. And we can look to the right here. The drawing that's in the Venetian archives of the original church and the proposed apartment block. And we do have this survive. So this is the church of 1600s by Contine, and it was a Baroque style church. And this was a rebuild because of a fire in 1628. And so if we go backwards in time, there's the apartment block, there's the church. So that's the footprints matching the building today. That's a speculation, but a very close speculation of the columns and the chapels of Contine's church, Francesco Contine. All right, there's the view. And so if we go backwards, if we look to the right and we impose an apse on center with the existing church, with the Baroque church, going back in time, we see that Aldus's front door was indeed on the campo, as if you were, the campo of San Paolo and the pharmacy there. The pharmacy feels it's like it's on the campo, even though there's an apse in front of it, and that would have been the condition here. And we know every island had a bakery, had their individual churches, and this was probably the only bakery we know of that ever existed on this island. So this is most likely, and this is the Calle Pastor, and still is today. So it's very unlikely that there was another bakery on this little island and that there was another Calle Pastor. But despite all that, every Aldus scholar believes in the plaque. All the guidebooks, if you were to look up Aldus's location, first location in any guidebook, would point to 2311 on the Rio Terra. And no one had ever, even though people speculated, including Norwich and Sir Norwich and a couple other Aldine scholars, no one ever illustrated this or really went through the digital mappings. And so I didn't come up with this. It was actually, I was tipped off by a president at the Grolier Club here in New York, who had mounted a show on Aldus 5 years ago. And I met him and he said, oh, if you go to Venice, I have this theory, but you're an architect, take a look, let me know. And then that became, over time, my sabbatical project. Well, it had tremendous success. I was able to publish this little booklet with a kind of a very boutique little bookshop that specializes in bilingual publications, a small run. And I was able to make my arguments. I first got connected through UNESCO, and then they kind of coached me. And I met with the Soprintendenza di Beni Culturali, and they agreed, and they were, and almost everyone in these offices are all architects. And they said, oh, no, this is absolutely, you're right. You know, there's no question. But they didn't have the authority. And I was bumped up to the assessore of the comune in charge of topomastica, which is maps and signage and plaques. And she approved it. What does that mean? It means that the owner can put up a plaque and take credits, but they would not sponsor a plaque. They would be happy to write the text of the plaque. And then the pandemic hits, and it is yet to happen. But ideally, and we had hopes of doing it during the Venice Biennale, that this would be memorialized. And my proposal was to take kind of reference to printing and take the Aldine stemma and have it in a kind of reverse, just like a printing block, and maybe have it above the door where there had been a stemma. I'm not arguing that it was actually Aldus's stemma, but you know, it's not a bad location. And that there would be another plaque detailing the story of Aldus, written by so that's my little book report. The work. I'm going to stop sharing. If I can figure that out. How do I I cannot finding my Zoom screen. Mo, can you unshare me?
Yes, I'll do that.
The screen collapsed here. Oh, I got it. Stop sharing.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, the booklet is a short booklet. The project was multimedia in a way. There were videos and walkthroughs, and it won Interior Design Educator Council's Media Award for its use of non-traditional research in digital formats. But David's talk is going to be much more interesting.
No. So what I want to do is pin you down why, because I actually, you're often very self-effacing about this, but you know, I think this is really important. not just because you did the detective work and you found this thing, but because I mean, at least maybe I'm overdoing it with Aldus, but you could argue that was one of the more famous sites within Venice. I mean, in the early 16th century, late 15th, early 16th century, Aldus Press was a kind of nexus of, the Republic of Letters and for scholarship and publications, you said, of Greek texts, but, it's obviously the famous Hypnerotomachia Polyphily and all kinds of things are coming out of that press. And he's in touch with everybody around Europe, like you said, Erasmus. And people came to him. I mean, people came to that shop. They came there and not to some other place. And it just kind of gets my imagination going, imagining what it would be like if you came to bother Aldus while he was trying to work, and what you would. I mean, you'd kind of hang out in the piazza. Would you? I mean, I think that the image of people gathering there, the fact that it was more than a printing press, it was actually a kind of a setting for I mean, at least his promotion of his press and himself, because I mean, we also know a lot about him relatively as publishers go, and he was a bit of a celebrity, and so that would be it's like finding a movie star's house in Hollywood, right? I mean, it's kind of a destination.
Well, it got so bad, David, that he put up sign on the front door, something to the effect that, please don't stop and talk unless you're going to help me with this Herculean task. So
right. So yeah, roll up your sleeves. But I mean, in that sense, I mean, I'm going to set myself up by saying this, but I see that as a kind of performance in a certain way. I mean, he's also, it's kind of complaining, but bragging that he's so popular that, he's constantly being bothered. And he's sort of announcing how important he is as a publisher by complaining about how many people show up to stop him from publishing. And I think of that as, I mean, a sort of deliberate projection of himself in a kind of performance of himself as a publisher. I mean, as a kind of, if not actually staged, at least a kind of, at least again, promotional kind of image making about himself, because he also, every publication that comes out of his press, there's a little dedicatory letter. And that's just one more way of him sort of, humble bragging a little bit about what he's doing. And he's not a behind the scenes kind of guy, right? I mean, so that place is actually important because it's kind of it becomes famous whether he wants you to come there and bother him or not. And I don't know. I find that, I think, interesting, fascinating. I think it's suggestive about how important publishing was in Venice, and about how much that was actually a very self-conscious kind of enterprise. I mean, and it demanded, kind of nonstop self-promotion.
He was well known.
Yeah. So I would like to see. I mean, Johannes and I have, vaguely hinted at what we're each going to talk about. I mean, I know a lot about Johannes's book, and I think it's really fantastic and fascinating, and a really great piece of detective work. I haven't really shared much of what I was going to talk about other than sort of hint at it. So maybe I should just share a couple of slides. I don't have many, and they're a little less visual than Johannes's. But I wonder if it might help sponsor a conversation and maybe engage some questions from others. So where am I? So somehow I've gotten out of my, there it is. Okay. So it's actually in a way not bad that I gave you the end of my, where am I here? I gave you the end of my presentation because I actually wanted to come back to it anyway. So let's start at the beginning. I keep doing that. So that should help your memory, because there's a bit about memory in this. So I'm going to say something about theaters and books and libraries in a way that I'm hoping is kind of suggestive and a little bit, I mean, obviously related, hopefully, to what Johannes is talking about, and the culture of books in Venice, and the idea of information that was both known. I mean, I think Aldus prided himself on his philology, his rigor. There's also something to be said for the unknown, or how much imperfect information one had, and the space in there, like Johannes has taken advantage of, in that unknown information for moments of creativity. So I want to talk about theaters and the relationship to the Libreria by Sansovino. The first one is a quote from Timanza in his life of Falconetto. So Gian Maria Falconetto is the architect of the Odeon and the Loggia, which is actually essentially a performance stage in Padua, the Loggia Cornaro. And in his life in the 18th century, Timanza says talking about theaters, because Falconetto was interested in theaters, and I think the idea of Roman theaters influenced his work. But it was also true that in the Renaissance, there wasn't actually that much known about theaters. There were no standing, functioning ancient theaters. There were a few survivors of the outsides of theaters. There essentially were no surviving scene fronds that were known and accessible. So there were plans, people knew what they must have looked like, but there weren't actually examples. You couldn't walk into an ancient theater and imagine performing. So Timanza says this, and this is still in the 18th century, and he's saying this as if it's present tense. He says, theaters and amphitheaters, being the most magnificent buildings of the Romans, so too are the most difficult to comprehend, regarding their structure on one hand and their use on the other. The fact that they're so important makes them attractive, but the fact that we don't know a lot about them makes them really interesting and challenging to kind of come to grips with. The other quote that I found in this really wonderful book of Venice and Vitruvius, Reading Venice with Daniele Barbaro and Andrea Palladio, is this from Daniele Barbaro says, once theaters and circuses and amphitheaters were in Rome, now entire cities are themselves theaters and circuses and amphitheaters. So because the theater, I think, is actually a kind of an ambiguous building for the Renaissance, in the sense that it was both fascinating and it was a sort of, as somebody has said, a known unknown, something about which people knew but didn't know enough. I think it became a fertile metaphor for thinking about other kinds of buildings and the way it might apply to other buildings. So these are two drawings of mine, of one on the left corner of Sansovino's Libreria, and on the right, the Theater of Marcellus in Rome. And it's well known that Sansovino uses essentially the ordering system of the facade of the Theater of Marcellus for the Libreria. The interesting question about that would be why, and in what way was that in some way deliberate? More than just a motif, more than just a formal architectural borrowing, but actually something that was suggestive of something. And again, I think something that has to do with the position, just like Aldus' house, it has to do with the position of the Libreria on the Piazzetta. In Tofori's book on Sansovino, he's talking about the Piazzetta, and Sansovino's buildings. And he says the Forum Salon Theater, speaking of that spectacular public space, is thus the site of a total spectacle in which myth, history, rhetorical eloquence, and civic functions find their synthesis. It's this sense of a salon that renders it available for a variety of functions and a freedom of development, that it's just neutral enough as a space that it can take on many different kinds of functions. And one of the things that's been pointed out in scholarship about about Sansovino's theater and the history of theaters in Venice, and eventually Baroque theaters, Baroque opera houses, is that the facade of the Libreria actually functioned as a kind of box, like the box in an opera house, because it wasn't just the Libreria, it was also the offices of the procurators. And the procurators would stand in their balconies on the facade of that building, looking into the Piazzetta, which was a space for performances of all kinds. And they were essentially spectators from essentially the facade of the theater into that outdoor performance space, that salon. It's also true that the Loggia was actually a kind of a theater-like space, in the sense that it was very much like a Scene Franz. In fact, in form, it's very much deliberately based on a Scene Franz. And in fact, the meetings that went on in there were essentially the performance of essentially public service, public political meetings, open to the public, or available, and therefore accessible, and but in a certain sense performed for public benefit. So both of those buildings, one's the outside of a theater, one's the stage of a theater, in both cases ancient Roman, are also spaces where, in one case, in the Logetta's case, the performance actually happens. In the facade of the Libreria, it's actually a space from which you can watch performances. So in a certain way, Sansovino's turned the theater inside out. He's taken the facade of the theater and made it the inside, and what will in fact become the inside of Baroque opera houses. What I've done here in this sketch is also relate to how it actually ties into the buildings around it. So the black sketches are the Libreria and the Logetta, and the Sanguine sketches are the context in the Doge's Palace and the Basilica of San Marco, because if you actually look at the facade of San Marco in plan, it actually looks like the plan of a Scene Franz. And it is also true that some of the formal system of the Logetta is related to the materiality essentially of the Basilica of San Marco, whereas the Libreria echoes and makes reference to the Doge's Palace on the opposite side, especially with the arcade on the ground floor. Later, Palladio actually gets to design essentially a performance space out on the lagoon for the visit of Henry III in Venice. And he actually designs two buildings that are actually sort of conflated. One is a kind of a loggia that is a space for essentially the celebration to happen, and then the passage towards Venice happens under this great triumphal arch. But they were arranged on axis and sequence, and they're often depicted in sort of oblique perspective. But if you overlay them, you actually, this is based on an 18th century drawings of these buildings. The ordering system actually works out so they're actually on a similar module. And so they actually overlay in a rather very deliberate way, where there's a correspondence between the columns of the loggia and the columns of the triumphal arch. So they're actually kind of collapsed into one, and they become a kind of an elaborate stage, performance space, and to a certain extent, again, like a kind of a Scene Franz. All that time that Sansovino's doing these things, and before Palladio's day, there's the famous memory theater of Giulio Camillo, which was apparently built in Venice. I mean, it existed. It was wooden. It's been described as a wooden structure, and in many, it's often reconstructed in terms of its complex, kind of iconography. It's sort of let's say metaphorical allusions. I thought about it as an architect from a slightly practical point of view, that, I mean, Camillo actually describes it as something that you could actually physically use, that it has to be essentially functional and accessible enough that you could actually have access to what are effectively drawers in the space of the cave of a theater. And in a sense, it's essentially a library. I mean, essentially it's a kind of compendium of texts. So if you'll indulge me, and I hope this will work, I'm just going to try to play this little video and see if it actually plays well enough. So I realized that in order for this thing to actually work, it had to be ergonometric. You had to be able to stand essentially on the stage and reach all the drawers. If you're actually supposed to have access to this thing, that if it's not just a mental model, but it's actually a physical thing to which you could actually have access, it can only be so big. And it actually was built inside another building, so it would have to fit within the salon, a salone of a Venetian, even a grand Venetian house. It couldn't be so big. So I think the advantage of doing this is getting a sense of how it fits in terms of size, because this is actually a kind of ordinary person's horizon line. But it does resolve itself into something obviously more kind of metaphorical and grand because of its form. It is a big building reduced to a miniature size. But it is effectively, I mean, I think one way of thinking about Giulio Camillo's memory theater is essentially it's a library. And it's a place that you essentially collect a comprehensive collection of books. And so in a way, it's not unrelated to Sansovino's Libreria. Sansovino's Libreria had the pretense of being comprehensive. It was meant to rival in its own way the Library of Alexandria. It had the Cardinal Bessarion's collection of books. It also had Petrarch's. it was essentially meant to be a great library that was a kind of comprehensive synthesis of knowledge. And in that sense, and because of the Giulio Camillo reference, it was a kind of a theater. But the idea that the theater was a kind of a world in miniature, that the theater was a kind of distillation of experience, but in a kind of condensed, kind of compact way. And so the theater as a metaphor has to do with this idea that Irving Lavin says when he talks about the use of the word teatro in Baroque Rome. He says it essentially can be reduced down to the idea that it represents the idea of wholeness or totality, that using teatro as a metaphor has to do with a sense of completeness, a kind of a condensed reality. And so in that sense, the theater as a suggestive metaphor, I think is a really, I think, wonderful way of thinking about how people understood the making of books in the case of Aldus, and that his publications were a kind of performance, and the collecting of books were kind of comprehensive in the way that theaters were attempting to be. And so what I wanted to leave you with were two more quotes. This one's from Samuel Johnson. He says, "Wit, you know, is the unsuspected copulation of ideas, the discovery of some occult relation between images and appearance remote from each other, and a fusion of wit, therefore, presupposes an accumulation of knowledge, a memory stored with notions, which the imagination may call out to compose new assemblages." And I think that's what I'm very interested in, the creative process, and the creative process, how it might have been understood in the Renaissance. And I think it actually takes two seemingly very antithetical things. It takes a body of knowledge, and it takes gaps in the knowledge or kind of unknown knowns that require you to imagine and invent, either completing them, filling them in, or because of their fuzzy ambiguity, you can apply them to other things. You can apply them in a metaphorical way to other things. And the last year, I won't go through this, but this is a Vasari quote from his Life of Taddeo Zucchero about the fact that Palladio had actually, before he designed the Teatro Olimpico, had actually designed a wooden theater, which Vasari says was a Colosseo. So I don't know if he means it was actually an amphitheater, not a theater, but it was in Venice, and it was in wood, and it was inside a building, like Camillo's Memory Theater. And whether Palladio knew that and what he was thinking about that is all just fodder for conversation. So that's what I wanted to do, is hopefully suggest some avenues of conversation and be suggestive about the way we can copulate ideas.
Super. Thank you both so much. I think with David's presentation, I'm drawn into this idea of books as buildings, buildings as books, and that for both of your presentations, the production and representation of knowledge became architectonic in many ways. And so I'm going to start off with a very brief question, and I invite everyone to please contribute. Please ask your own questions. And so what I also have to acknowledge too is Venice's birthday, 1600 years. And I'm thinking just to step away for a moment from the specifics of your presentations, to think about when we are witness to or part of these uncovering of these kind of detective stories. I think you used that term, Johannes. And when we're specific about Venice, how do you imagine that your individual projects are in some way pushing then the question of what architecture was, especially during this period, but what architecture might be considered or understood as, or represented even, specifically to David's representations and drawings today. I'm always fascinated by kind of these historical taking apart of narratives and then putting them back together again to assert new ideas or radical ideas in the case of Johannes.
Certainly in my case, it's the layers in that the book isn't static, that things are added upon, edited. In the case of the Church of St. Augustine, there are remnants. It's never eradicated, but it is still there if you're willing to take the time and read it. I mean, my take is probably very divergent from David's theater of books, theater of memory, but I think of also Giordano Bruno and place and memory, and this idea of you remember things through place, and we have our compartments of place, which could be a metaphor for books as well, as David implies.
I don't know if it was true, Johannes and I are close enough, I think, in age that I imagine it was true that, I mean, the book that we were all have expected to have read as an architect when I was in school was Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. And precisely because it was both very specific in a lot of ways architecturally, but it was evocative and suggestive, and in a way that allowed you a kind of a freedom of imagination from which you could think about things in other ways, that it wasn't prescriptive. It was just tantalizingly suggestive enough that I think every reader of that book can imagine a different setting for each of those cities that he describes. He gives you just enough to get your mind going, but not so much that he does all the work for you. And I think there's something in the capacity of books essentially to suggest new ideas, that it's in the sense in which they leave some gaps, or they leave some possibilities for exploration. And I think Venice does that. I mean, getting around Venice, that's one of Calvino's themes, is, it takes a memory to find your way from, the book publisher's shop to the bakery to the, and that kind of thing, I think is a kind of mental map that I think, going back to Venice every time, I find it's a different city for me because I'm different, and the way I read it and I come at it is different. It's a different city every time. And that, I think that's in that sense, reading Venice, it's not, you're never reading the same book. It's always a different book.
I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I'd like to point out Mr. Philip Jones here today, who actually uses Venice in his Philip is a teacher of English in Venice, and has used the city of Venice as the framework by which his fictions take place. So here's a real author.
Well, it's very kind of you to say so, Johannes. Yeah, I've been living in Venice now for 9 years. I've written 5 novels set in the city, 5 thrillers set in the city. What I think is maybe interesting, if I can just go on for a little bit, I'd never written anything prior to living in Venice. And I think it's just really, the city is a puzzle. It's a detective story in itself. Wherever you go, you look at the names of the streets and you think there's a story there somewhere. Why is this the street of the assassins? Why is this the small square of the dead? You walk around, you see these signs, you see these buildings. And I've always said to people, it's not just that it's an inspiration to write, it's pretty much an obligation to write. So thank you very much for the opportunity there.
Well, you're the one with real experience here.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of in awe of, this forensic ability that, both you and David have talked about today in examining the absolute minutiae of the city. I mean, and I don't think there are that many in the cities in the world which attract this forensic attention to detail as Venice. It's special in that way. People love this city in a way. They focus on every tiny little aspect of it, and they uncover these extraordinary things from it. And that's one of the things that makes it special, definitely.
I would just chime in and say that I like this idea of the forensic uncovering. It's not an archaeology. It's actually it's a piecing together. Is very unique to Venice. Even in discourses around Rome, for instance, which I'm more familiar with, you don't have that degree of an, maybe I won't say analysis, but the narrative structuring, the narrative kind of intersections that you find that are very specific to not only place, but also that place, as Johannes and David both suggest, kind of extends temporalities in very unique ways that you just don't necessarily, well, would ever understand just on the face of it.
And it's highly subjective. I mean, the idea of Kevin Lynch and mental maps and how Venetians' view of their own city is very unique. Through landmarks, edges, and all those terms Kevin Lynch coined. I started a project quite literally almost 14 years ago when I was first at the Emily Harvey, and I was looking for a project. And so I always found Venetian business cards to be highly unique in that they might have the street address. That's not how you're going to find the place. That any good Venetian business card will have a map on it. So I collected 200 of these cards, and I had them kicking around in my drawer for years. And then I finally, I guess, developed the technology. I'm not the most digitally savvy, but I scanned all of them, and then I created a new map of Venice, taking these 200 maps of Venice. And things that were in perspective were placed in a perspectival way with the picture plane, and things that are in plan were kept. And so you had multiple, 100 different San Marcos and 100 different Rialtos. And I did a fly through that eventually became a video in a collateral exhibition at the Biennale. Oh, I guess that's 5 years ago. So it was a project called Venice Remapped, and had flashbacks and wireframes, and so it became very kind of psychedelic.
Would anyone like to ask further questions or comments, please? The floor is yours. The proverbial gridded floor of the screen we're all facing.
Tiles.
Well, just in case nobody's going to ask any questions, can I just say it's been lovely to be here tonight. Johannes, I hope it's not too long before you're back in Venice again. David, I hope we meet up one day if you're up from Rome.
Yes.
Do get in touch. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. I look forward, Philip.
Fantastic.
I have a question about the publishing range that took place in Venice. To how far did the products of all these publishing houses travel? Was it immediate in the Veneto, or did they go to the extent of the world as we know it then? How did they go around? And then along with that, I know it's probably not immediately at the same period, but if Palladio had been somewhere else, would he have been as well known?
Wow.
Because of the propensity for reporting on architecture as you're describing it, and the concern of understanding the magic and the mystery of architecture.
I think most people don't really realize what an empire Venice was in 1500. I mean, maybe it's eclipsed by our memory of the Roman Empire, the later French Empire. But at that point in time, its reach was the Dalmatians and such. But in terms of Aldus, he had big issues in that he had a Venetian copyright within the empire towards even his fonts. He had a copyright towards his Latin and Greek fonts. And he had huge problems where people in France and other people were just mimicking his achievements. And he didn't, so I don't know how much further that went. And I know the books were certainly, Erasmus knew of it in Holland, and people well beyond the Venetian Empire were stealing his humanistic achievements. So was it known in China? Probably not, but it is vast. And
Venice was because it was a trading empire. I mean, it was a perfect place to sell books. I mean, it's a great place to distribute things, and it's also the place where everything comes to. And that's why Alexandria had its great libraries, because they confiscated every book that came into the port. And it's not an accident that Venice's library is right at the port. I mean, essentially, even though they weren't confiscating books, it was a place where everything arrived and everything also went out again. And that sense of it being a kind of a global, a relatively global nexus is, I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better place to be a publisher.
I know that it's thought in I spent a lot of time in Fez in Morocco, and in the oldest library there, the Carouine, they have books from this period in that library as well. And I completely agree with David's kind of thinking of the book as being disseminated as a form of knowledge, but also that replicating or mapping onto these networks that are happening across the world. And that's happening both with architecture, it's happening with ideas and theories of mathematics. I mean, it's so, that's why I love these ideas that the book is a building, the building is a book. And when we start to kind of, when we start to imagine or reimagine these narratives and these linkages across time, it means, or it suggests to me, that at least we can read sometimes the architecture of Venice through the architecture of Timbuktu, or the architecture of Timbuktu in Venice, and so forth. That we shouldn't necessarily just limit ourselves to the location, but actually imagine these locations as being very dynamic, as I think both of your presentations have shown, or at least alluded to.
But to answer the question, or at least to give some guidance, there was an amazing exhibition called Printing, Evolution and Society 1450-1500, curated by Cristina Dondi at the Correr, that used data. And because everything is now scanned and documented, she was able to prove the expanse of these books and how Venetian printing had a tremendous influence. It's an awesome catalog. The show was extended. I mean, it's closed now, but it took the data and created the narrative. And it's astounding in terms of the exact question we were being asked is, how far did this go? But she also talked about the monetary trade and the value. And it was all through data sourcing, and how that really, instead of just being talk, she actually was able to quantify it and visualize it in a way Edward Tufte would do it. A fascinating show.
If I could just make a last claim for us as Johannes and I as architects, I think because I have a lot of really wonderful friends who are historians, and historians are often bound by a kind of a code of rigor and archival research that we architects are not subject to. And when we don't, when the information is missing, we're not, shy about making it up. And actually, I think that's been true for a long time. And I think our architects often went off on very little knowledge and spun yarns and invented whole new ways of making buildings on fragmentary information. And there's something actually to be said for that. I think that's. I think we have, and I hope we also continue to keep having conversations with our historian friends. And that's been one of the great things for me about the Academy is the connections between the historians and people who practice architecture and the arts, that we come at things very differently, but I think we each have something to say to each other.
Exactly. I think the Academy allows for architects to become historians and historians to become architects. And we all together then benefit so greatly from those intersections. Mo?
Yeah, there is actually a reconstruction of the Memory Theater that took place a number of years ago underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. So inside the Brooklyn Bridge, the Anchorage put it on, and it was a theater director named Matthew McGuire. And so as you went into all these little spaces, there would be a different play that would take place within each of the spaces. But I just, very interesting, I not put that together with Joseph Camillo as being, the beginning of that. So that was really fascinating. I just want to thank you very much, Johannes and David. That was really marvelous. And to give a little plug for next week, we're back to our Tuesday at 6 o'clock time. This is on July 27, and we have Erica Valladares and Lauren Peterson, and they're going to be talking Seeing Unseen Romans. So hope to see you then, and thank you very, very much. Thank you, Sean. Thank you all who came. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Buona serata. Grazie.
Buona serata a tutti. Thank you all.
Grazie, Philip.
Piacere.
Grazie a tutti. Ciao.
Julio Camillo, sorry about that.
Bye-bye. I'll see you next weekend.
Yes,
right?
lovely. See you next weekend.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was super great.
Yeah, sorry I know it was so scattered, but this was a pleasure.
No,
It's always a pleasure, and thank you for being on this committee with me. I really appreciate that as well.
I'm happy to help, and hopefully we'll have another group meeting. That was fun last time.
Yeah. David, congratulations on whatever you're up to. And thank you very much for today.
Thank you. All right. Thanks for all your work.
Thanks, David.
Buonanotte.
Buonanotte.
Bye-bye.